Ambassador Kethvarin had lived for 312 years, and in all that time he had never once felt the cold sensation that now crept along the ridges of his exoskeleton as he entered the Galactic Concord Hall on the neutral station known as Axis Primara. He was Veloxi, tall, armored in natural chitin plates the color of dark iron, with 4 arms that ended in claws capable of shearing through starship hull plating, and compound eyes that could track a missile in flight. And yet something about today made him feel small. The hall was enormous, a cathedral of glass and living metal that floated at the gravitational midpoint between 3 star systems, built centuries ago as neutral ground where the galaxy's many species could meet without fear of ambush or treachery. And today every seat in the chamber was filled. That alone was unusual. The last time the full Concord had gathered was 11 standard years ago, when a rogue black hole had threatened an entire trade corridor, and even then a dozen species had not bothered to attend. But today there were no empty seats, no absent delegations, no species that had decided the matter was beneath their attention. Today the galaxy had come together for one reason: humans. Kethvarin settled into his designated alcove and folded all 4 arms across his thorax as he watched the other delegations take their places around the vast circular chamber. And the tension in the air was so thick he could taste it through the chemical receptors on his antennae. A sharp, acrid mixture of fear and anger, and something else he could not quite name. The Dralith hegemony had sent not diplomats, but warriors, Commander Sorath, and a retinue of armored reptilian soldiers, who moved with the rigid discipline of a species that had built its entire civilization around conquest and martial honor. And their scales were a deep crimson that darkened further when they were agitated, which meant that right now, every single one of them was nearly black. The Selthari communion was present as a shimmering cloud of pale light hovering above a crystalline platform, a telepathic hive mind species that experienced the universe as a single shared consciousness. And their speaker, a fragile humanoid vessel named Umivane, sat cross-legged beneath the light with her eyes closed and her lips moving in silent conversation with the millions of minds linked to her own. The Irani Collective had sent Scholar Dren in an atmospheric pod the size of a small shuttle, because the Irani were gas giant dwellers who breathed methane and hydrogen, and Dren's massive translucent form pressed against the walls of the pod like a storm cloud trapped in a bottle. There were hundreds of other species too: the feathered Kailafi, the silicon-based Morvathi, the aquatic Pelennor floating in mobile tanks, and every single one of them had come here today because they were afraid of the same. A species that had only been part of galactic civilization for 200 years. A species that had crawled out of a single unremarkable planet, orbiting a single unremarkable yellow star in the outer arm of an unremarkable spiral galaxy. A species that should have been nothing. The session began when High Arbiter Zelen, an ancient Veloxi like Kethvarin but far older, her chitin faded to the pale gray of extreme age, struck her ceremonial staff against the floor 3 times, and the sound rang through the chamber like a funeral bell. "This emergency session of the Galactic Concord is convened," she announced, her voice carried by translation fields to every ear and receptor and membrane in the room, to address the continued expansion and military threat posed by the species known as Homo sapiens, native designation, humanity. Kethvarin watched the reactions ripple through the chamber. The Dralith stiffened, the Selthari cloud pulsed brighter. The Urani's form swirled with dark bands of color, and he realized that the unnamed emotion he had been tasting on the air was not just fear, it was dread. The kind of dread that came not from facing something powerful, but from facing something you did not understand. "In the 2 centuries since first contact," Zelen continued, "humanity has expanded to occupy over 400 worlds, across 9 galactic sectors, has survived 3 major pandemics that would have rendered any other species extinct, has developed weapons technology that rivals civilizations 10 times their age, and has won every single military conflict declared against them without exception. She paused and let that last detail settle over the chamber like ash. The purpose of this session is to hear testimony from affected species, to evaluate the threat humanity poses to galactic stability, and to determine whether the Concord should authorize a united military response. Before it is too late, Keth Varen felt his claws tighten involuntarily against his own arms. He had read the intelligence reports, of course, every ambassador had. But hearing it spoken aloud in the formal language of the Concord made it feel real in a way that data files never could. 400 worlds in 200 years. No species had ever expanded that fast. Not even the Draelith at the height of their empire. Not even the Veloxi during the long hunt. Before we proceed, Zelene said, raising one thin arm for silence, the Concord has exercised its right to summon a representative of the accused species to answer the central question before this body. She turned her ancient compound eyes toward the great doors at the far end of the hall. That question is this: why should the galaxy not unite to destroy humanity before it is too late? The doors opened. They were enormous things, 40 meters tall, built to accommodate species of every size, and they groaned as they swung inward, and every eye and sensor and optical organ in the chamber turned toward the opening. A single figure walked through. She was small, absurdly, laughably small compared to the Draelith warriors and the Veloxi and the massive Arani, barely reaching the chest height of the shortest species present, and she wore a simple dark uniform with no armor and no visible weapons. Her hair was dark and cut short, and her skin was a warm brown, and her eyes were steady and calm as she looked up at the hundreds of alien faces staring down at her. She was smiling. Not a predator smile, not a challenge or a threat display, just a simple, warm, human smile. And somehow, that was the most unsettling thing Keth Varen had ever seen. "My name is Captain Marin Voss," she said, and her voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the translation fields, "Chief Diplomatic Envoy of the United Earth Commonwealth, and I am here to answer your question." She looked around the chamber once, meeting every gaze without flinching, and then she folded her small, soft, terrifyingly capable hands behind her back and waited. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Keth Varen had ever heard. The first to rise was Commander Sorath of the Draelith hegemony, and when he stood, the chamber felt it. Not just because he was nearly 3 meters of scaled muscle and natural bone armor, but because the rage rolling off him was so intense that even species without empathic senses could feel it pressing against their skin like heat from a furnace. He did not look at the other delegates. He looked only at Marin Voss. 2 standard years ago, Sorath began, his voice a low grinding sound, like stone dragged across stone. The Draelith hegemony deployed the 9th Assault Legion to secure the Kessara Corridor. 12,000 of our finest shock troops, veterans of 30 campaigns, equipped with the most advanced weaponry our civilization has ever produced. He pressed a control on his gauntlet, and the air above the center of the chamber filled with a holographic projection. Battlefield footage captured from Draelith helmet cameras, and what it showed, several delegates gasp, or hiss, or emit sounds of distress in their own languages. They were met by a human force of 400. The footage showed a narrow mountain pass on a rocky world, and in that pass a line of humans in battered armor crouched behind hastily built barricades of stone and metal. And even through the grainy combat footage, Keth Varen could see their faces, dirty, exhausted, bleeding from wounds that would have incapacitated most species, and every single one of them was still fighting. 400 humans held that pass for 11 days, Sorath said, and his voice cracked on the number in a way that the translator struggled to render. But Kethvarin recognized the sound because he had heard it before in his own species. It was the sound of someone trying very hard not to show fear. They did not retreat, they did not surrender, they did not break, and on the 12th day our legion withdrew because we had lost 6,000 soldiers, and the humans had lost 31. The number hung in the air. 6,000 Drelith, killed by 400 humans. Sorath shut off the projection and sat down without another word, and his scales were so dark they were almost indistinguishable from the shadows around him. The next to speak was Umivane of the Selthari Communion, and when she opened her eyes, the shimmering cloud above her pulsed with rapid patterns of light that meant millions of linked minds were paying attention through her. During the conflict at Kasara, Umivane said in a voice that had the strange harmonic quality of someone speaking with many minds at once, "The Communion captured a human prisoner, a soldier, wounded but alive, and we did what we have done with every new species we have encountered in our 4,000-year history." She paused, and her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "We attempted to read his mind. The Selthari were the most powerful telepaths in the galaxy. Known space, they could strip the thoughts from nearly any sentient being as easily as peeling the skin from fruit, and they had used this ability for millennia to understand and catalog the mental structures of every species they encountered. What we found," Umavan continued, and her voice was barely above a whisper now, "was not what we expected." She looked directly at Voss, and there was something in her expression that Kethvarin had never seen on a Selthari vessel before. Genuine confusion. Every species we have ever scanned has a dominant mental architecture. The Drelith are built around hierarchy and dominance, the Veloxi around the hunt and the swarm, the Orani around collective harmony, but humans have no single architecture, no dominant pattern, no central organizing principle. She pressed her fingertips together, and the cloud above her flickered with agitated light. Instead, we found chaos, layers upon layers of contradictory impulses, existing simultaneously, memories of tenderness wrapped around memories of violence, mathematical precision tangled with irrational emotion, and buried beneath all of it, something we have never encountered in any other species in 4,000 years of scanning. The chamber was absolutely silent. "Empathy for the enemy," Umavan said, and her voice shook as she said it. "This human soldier, this man who had killed dozens of Drelith warriors with his own hands, not hours before his capture, held in his mind genuine sorrow for the beings he had killed, genuine grief for lives he had ended, and genuine hope that one day his species and theirs would not have to fight at all." She took a breath that seemed to require enormous effort. He felt all of these things simultaneously, and without contradiction, and when we tried to understand how this was possible, the feedback nearly shattered our communion link across 3 star systems. Again, we classify this as an aberration, a mental structure that should not be able to exist, and we do not know what it means, and that terrifies us. The final testimony came from Scholar Dren of the Urani Collective, whose massive translucent body pressed against the walls of the atmospheric pod as complex bioluminescent patterns rippled through its form. The Urani equivalent of pulling up research notes. The collective has conducted extensive biological analysis of the human species, Dren said in a deep resonant voice that vibrated the floor. And our findings are as follows. The data appeared in holographic displays around the chamber, anatomical diagrams, genetic sequences, performance metrics, and Kethvarin studied them with growing unease. Humans are persistence predators evolved on a high-gravity death world with extreme axial tilt, producing violent seasonal changes that would destroy most ecosystems, and they adapted by becoming the single most versatile biological organism we have ever documented. Dren highlighted specific data points with pulses of light inside its body. They can sustain physical activity for periods that exceed any known species by a factor of 10. They heal from wounds that would be fatal to 97% of cataloged sentient beings. They can function after losing up to 40% of their blood volume. They consume chemical compounds that are lethal poisons to most life forms, including ethanol and caffeine and capsaicin, recreationally and for pleasure. And their skeletal muscular system is specifically optimized for throwing objects with lethal force and for sustained close-quarters combat. The scholar paused as if gathering courage. Based on the totality of our analysis, the Urani Collective classifies Homo sapiens as a Class 12 apex organism. A murmur swept through the chamber, like wind through dry grass. For context, Dren added, classification scale only goes to 12, and until now the rating was entirely theoretical, because we did not believe any species could actually meet every criterion simultaneously. The murmur became a roar of voices and sounds and emissions as hundreds of species reacted at once. And through it all, Kethvarin sat in his alcove and watched Marin Voss. She had not moved during any of the testimony. She had not flinched when the battle footage played, or when Umavine described the chaos of the human mind, or when Dren classified her species as the most dangerous biological organism in the known galaxy. She had simply listened, occasionally making notes on a small device in her hand. And now, as the chamber erupted around her, she waited with the patience of someone who had all the time in the universe. High Arbiter Zelen struck her staff 3 times, and the noise subsided reluctantly. The testimony phase is concluded, she announced. Captain Voss, the floor is yours, and you may now respond to the charges presented against your species. Marin Voss stepped forward to the center of the chamber floor, a small figure surrounded on all sides by beings that could crush her, dissolve her, tear her apart, or shatter her mind, and she stood there with her hands clasped behind her back and her chin raised, and she began to speak. You are afraid of us, she said, and you should be. That was not what anyone had expected, and the chamber stirred with confusion, because every species present had assumed the human would deny the charges, or argue against them, or try to minimize what humanity had done. But instead, she was confirming everything. Everything you have said about us is true, Voss continued, every single word of it. And Commander Sorath, your soldiers at Kasara fought with incredible bravery, and I want you to know that, before I say what I am about to say. Sorath's dark eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. You are right to fear us, Voss said. The Selthari are right that our minds are chaotic and contradictory. The Orani are right that our biology is designed for violence. And the Draelith are right that we are extremely difficult to kill. But none of you know the half of it, because everything you have shown today is what we do to others. She paused, and the chamber leaned forward. Let me tell you what we have done to ourselves. She pressed a control on her wrist, and the holographic display above the chamber floor came alive. But what it showed was not alien battlefields or biological data. It showed Earth. 400 years before we ever left our homeworld, Voss said, we fought a war against ourselves that killed 70 million of our own people in 6 years. The number translated across every language in the chamber, and the reactions were immediate. Gasps, clicks, whistles, flashes of bioluminescent horror. We called it the Second World War, which means there was a first one, which killed 20 million. Between and after those wars, we committed acts against our own kind that I will describe to you now, because you deserve to know exactly what you are dealing with. She told them about the Holocaust. 6 million of her own species systematically murdered in factories designed for the purpose of killing. And she told them about the atomic bombs dropped on 2 cities full of civilians. And she told them about centuries of slavery where humans bought and sold other humans as property. And she told them about the genocides in Rwanda and Armenia, and Cambodia, and Bosnia. And with each new horror, the chamber grew quieter and quieter, until the silence was so heavy it felt like gravity had doubled. "We did not do these things because we were forced to," Voss said, and her voice was steady. But Kethvarin could see that her hands behind her back were gripping each other so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "We did them because we chose to, because inside every single human being there is a capacity for cruelty that is almost limitless. A darkness that can swallow whole civilizations if we let it." She let the holographic images fade, and the chamber was left in the dim ambient light. "There is an old story on our world," she said, "about two wolves. And in this story, an elder tells a young one that inside every person there are two wolves fighting. One is rage and hatred and violence and cruelty, and the other is compassion and kindness and courage and love. And the young one asks, which wolf wins?" She looked around the chamber. The elder answers, "The one you feed." She took a single step forward, and her boot made a sound on the metal floor that echoed in the silence. Every human being is born with both of those wolves inside them, and every single day of our lives we make a choice about which one to feed, and that choice is not easy, and it is not guaranteed, and sometimes, too many times, we choose wrong. Die, and civilizations burn, and the darkness wins. Her voice dropped lower. But sometimes we choose right. She activated the holographic display again, and this time the images were different. "During the Kessera conflict," she said, "while our soldiers were holding that pass against 12,000 Drelith troops, a human medical ship called the Gentle Morning broke through the Drelith naval blockade, not to deliver weapons or reinforcements, but to reach a Drelith colony on the fourth moon of Kessera Prime that had been struck by a respiratory plague." The display showed footage from the medical ship. Human doctors and nurses in protective suits working in a Drelith settlement, treating sick Drelith children whose scales had turned a pale, sickly yellow, carrying supplies through muddy streets while artillery fire lit up the sky above them. Those doctors knew that the Drelith hegemony was trying to kill their fellow soldiers less than a star. "System away," Voss said. "They went anyway, because people were sick and they could help, and that was enough of a reason." She showed another image. Human engineers in heavy environmental suits, working on the surface of an airless moon, welding pipes and calibrating atmospheric processors under a sky full of unfamiliar stars. 3 years ago, the Urani Collective reported that the atmospheric processors on their colony moon of Velsha were failing, and the colony of 800,000 would suffocate within a year. And they sent requests for help to every species in the Concord. And do you know how many responded? She held up a single finger. One, and it was us. A team of human engineers who spent 3 years living in sealed habitats on an airless rock, breathing recycled air and eating processed food, so that 800,000 beings they had never met and would never meet again could keep breathing. The holographic display faded, and Voss stood alone in the dim light. "Commander Sorath, at Kessara, after the battle, your wounded were left on the field because your retreat was too fast to collect them. And it was human soldiers who carried Drelith wounded to medical stations and treated their injuries, the same humans who had been killing them hours before. And they did this not because they were ordered to, not because it gave them any tactical advantage, but because they looked at your dying soldiers and saw people who were in pain and could not bear to walk away." Sorath's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. "Speaker Umivan, the aberration you found in our prisoner's mind, the empathy for the enemy, that is not a flaw in our design. It is the whole point of our design. It is the thing that has kept us from destroying ourselves 100 times over. It is the second wolf, and it is the reason we are still here." Voss took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was clear and strong and never carried to every corner of the vast chamber. "You asked me why the galaxy should not unite to destroy us, and here is my answer. You are afraid of us because we can destroy you. Because we are built for war, and we are very good at it. And you are right, we can. And if you come for us, we will fight, and we will not stop until one side or the other is gone. Because that is what the first wolf does. She looked up at the hundreds of faces staring down at her. But has it occurred to any of you to ask a different question? Has it occurred to you to wonder, if we are as dangerous as you say, if we are truly the most lethal species in this galaxy, why have we not already destroyed you? The question hung in the air like smoke. We have had the ability to conquer every species in this room for decades, Voss said quietly. We have weapons you have not seen, and technologies you have not imagined. And we have the biological drive to use them. And every single day we make the choice not to. She let the silence hold for 3 heartbeats. That is not weakness. That is the hardest thing any species can do, and we do it every single day, and we will keep doing it, because the wolf we choose to feed is the one that matters. She stopped speaking, and the chamber was so quiet that Kethvarin could hear the hum of the station's life support systems cycling air through the vents. No one moved, no one spoke, and Kethvarin realized, with a feeling he had no word for in any language, the truth was not what was said. It was what was left unspoken. Language he knew, that he was looking at the most dangerous being he had ever encountered, not because of what she could do, but because of what she was choosing not to do. The chamber erupted the moment Voss stopped speaking, and the sound was enormous. Hundreds of species all reacting at once in their own languages and frequencies and chemical emissions. A tidal wave of noise that made the translation fields stutter and glitch as they tried to keep up. Some of the delegates were moved. Kethvarin could see it in the way the Kylathi delegation had spread their feathers in the gesture that meant deep contemplation, and in the way the Irani scholar Pren's body had shifted to pale luminous blue, which the Veloxi intelligence files said indicated a state of wonder. But others were not moved at all. Commander Sorath was on his feet before the noise had even peaked, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade through cloth. "Manipulation," he snarled, and his crimson scales rippled with fury. "This is exactly what makes humans the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Not their strength, not their endurance, not their weapons, but their ability to make you feel sympathy for them while they are holding a knife behind their back." He turned to face the assembly, and his soldiers stood in perfect unison behind him, a wall of scaled muscle and barely contained violence. "She tells us beautiful stories about compassion and choice. But she also just told us, with her own mouth, that her species built factories to murder millions of their own kind. And you want to trust these creatures? You want to believe that the wolf they feed today will be the same wolf they feed tomorrow." A rumble of agreement rolled through parts of the chamber. The Morvathi, the Pelaxis, several smaller delegations who had lost ships or colonies to human expansion. "I call for an immediate vote," Sorath declared, "to authorize a combined fleet strike against humanity's core systems, Earth, Mars, Centauri, and the Jovian stations, before this species grows any stronger." High Arbiter Zelend struck her staff for order, but the noise did not die easily this time, and it took several minutes before the chamber settled into an uneasy, crackling quiet. "A formal vote requires a 12-hour deliberation period," Zelend announced. "This session is in recess until the next cycle. All delegates will retire to their quarters and consider their positions." The chamber began to empty slowly, species clustering with their allies and whispering in tight, anxious groups. Kethvarin found himself standing in his alcove long after the others had begun to leave, unable to move, unable to stop thinking about what he had just witnessed. He was a predator. His species had been apex hunters on their homeworld for 50 million years before they had ever built their first city, and the instinct to kill was woven so deeply into Veloxi biology that their greeting ritual was a display of claws, a way of saying, "I could kill you, but I choose not to right now." He had always thought that was a sign of civilization. But hearing Voss speak, hearing her describe a species that fought against its own nature every single day, that carried the capacity for genocide and compassion in the same heart, and had to choose between them moment by moment, that was something different. That was something he did not have a name for. He found himself walking through the curved corridors of Axis Primara, without a clear destination, carrying him on autopilot while his mind churned. And he was not entirely surprised when he rounded a corner and found Maren Voss standing alone by a viewing window, looking out at the stars. She turned when she heard his footsteps, all four of them, and she looked up at him without any sign of fear, which was unusual because most species found the Veloxi deeply frightening at close range, and Kethvaran was large even by Veloxi standards. "Ambassador Kethvaran," she said, "I was wondering if any of you would come find me." "You know my name," he said. "I studied every delegate's file before I came here," she replied. "I know all your names." He regarded her for a moment, this small soft creature who had stood in a room full of beings that could destroy her and had not flinched. And then he asked the question that was burning in his mind. "Are you afraid?" She looked at him, and for the first time the calm composure cracked. Just slightly. Just enough for him to see something underneath, not weakness, but honesty. "I am terrified," she said quietly. "I have been terrified since the moment I walked through those doors." "You did not show it." "No," she agreed. "Humans are very good at hiding fear. It is one of the things that makes us dangerous, and also one of the things that keeps us alive." Kethvaran leaned against the corridor wall, and his chitin plates clicked softly as he settled his weight. "If the vote goes against your species," he said, "what will you do?" Voss was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the stars. "We would survive," she said finally. "We always do. We would fight your combined fleets, and we would take terrible losses, and we would do terrible things, and in the end, we would still be here, because that is what humans do. We endure, we adapt, we refuse to die." She turned to face him, and her dark eyes were bright with something fierce. "But I do not want to survive," she said. "I want to do better than that. I want my species to be more than the thing that would not die. I want us to be the thing that made the galaxy better for having existed. And that is why I am here, and that is why I am terrified, because if this doesn't work, then the wolf we have been trying so hard to feed will starve, and the other one will eat everything." Kethvaran stared at her, and felt something shift inside his mind. A tectonic movement, slow and deep, like the continental plates of his homeworld grinding against each other far below the surface. Before he could respond, the station shuddered. It was not a subtle tremor. It was a violent lurch that threw Voss off her feet and sent Kethvaran staggering sideways on his four legs. And then the emergency lights came on, flooding the corridor in pulsing red, and the station's alarm system began to scream. "Reactor core instability detected," the station's automated voice announced, in flat mechanical tones. "Structural failure in sectors 7 through 12. All personnel evacuate to designated safety zones." The floor tilted, and through the viewing window, Kethvaran could see a section of the station's outer ring buckling, metal tearing apart in silence in the vacuum of space, and atmosphere venting in white plumes that crystallized instantly into ice. Voss was already on her feet, blood running from a cut on her forehead where she had struck the wall, and she had a communicator in her hand, and was speaking into it with a voice that had transformed completely. No longer the calm diplomat, but something harder, something forged in fire. "Voss to Commonwealth Fleet, Emergency Protocol 7. Axis Primara is breaking apart. I need every Marine unit, every medical team, every engineer we have on this station in the next 15 minutes. Full rescue operations. All sectors, all species, no exceptions. Kethvarin heard the response crackle. Through the communicator. A human voice, confused, asking for confirmation. You heard me, Voss said, and her voice was iron. All species, the Dralith, the Selthari, the Veloxi, everyone. I do not care what they were voting to do to us an hour ago. There are people dying on this station, and we are going to save every single one of them, or die trying. Move. She looked up at Kethvarin, and for one moment he saw everything. The fear, the determination, the stubbornness, the compassion, all of it existing simultaneously in those dark human eyes, just as Umavan had described. Chaos and contradiction, and something that burned so brightly it hurt to look at. Ambassador, can you move? Yes. Then help me. She turned and ran down the corridor toward the sound of the explosions. And Kethvarin, 312-year-old predator, apex hunter, senior diplomat of the Veloxi Dominion, followed a creature half his size into the fire without a moment's hesitation. Moment of hesitation. In the sectors that were failing, the other species were doing what instinct demanded. The Dralith had formed defensive perimeters around their own delegates, shields locked, weapons drawn, protecting their own. The Selthari had withdrawn into a tight telepathic communion, their shared consciousness pulling inward like a fist closing. And the Urani had sealed their atmospheric pods and were drifting toward the nearest escape route. Every species was protecting itself. And then the humans arrived. They came through the buckled corridors in squads of 5 and 10. Marines in heavy armor, breaching jammed bulkheads with cutting tools and raw physical strength. Medics, carrying bags of supplies and shouting instructions in half a dozen alien languages they had clearly studied for exactly this kind of moment. Engineers, dragging portable generators and atmospheric sealant kits. And they did not sort the wounded by species. Wrenched open a collapsed doorway and pulled out a Dralith delegate who was pinned under fallen debris. And the Dralith's scales turned pale with shock, as the human, a woman no bigger than Voss, lifted a beam that should have been too heavy for any human to move, and held it long enough for 2 more Marines to drag the Dralith free. In another sector, human medics reached a group of Selthari whose telepathic link was fracturing from the pain and panic of wounded members. And the medics could not feel the telepathic distress, but they could see the physical symptoms: convulsions, bleeding from the eyes, collapse. And they treated them with a gentle efficiency that made Kethvarin's chest ache with something he still could not name. In the reactor section, human engineers worked shoulder to shoulder with Urani technicians. The humans in emergency suits breathing bottled air, while they jury-rigged containment fields around the failing reactor core. As a young human engineer, barely more than a child by Veloxi standards, climbed into a radiation-flooded access shaft without hesitation to manually seal a coolant valve. The boy's hands were shaking. He went anyway. By the time the reactor was stabilized and the station's structural integrity was restored to minimum safe levels, 4 human Marines were dead, crushed, irradiated, or blown into space by explosive decompression, and 11 more were critically injured. They had saved over 6,000 lives. None of the lives they saved were human. The Concorde reconvened 6 hours later, in a cargo bay on the station's least damaged deck, because the grand chamber was no longer structurally sound. And the difference between this gathering and the one that had taken place earlier was so vast it might as well have been a different universe. There were no ceremonial protocols now. There were no formal alcoves or species-designated seating areas or holographic display systems. Just a large metal room with emergency lighting and makeshift benches, and the delegates who filled it were ash-streaked and bruised and bandaged and fundamentally changed in ways they were only beginning to understand. High Arbiter Zelene had a crack running down the left side of her chitin from a falling support beam. and she stood at the front of the room without her ceremonial staff, because it had been lost somewhere in the wreckage. And she did not strike anything 3 times to call the session to order. She simply said, "We are here," and the room went quiet. Marin Voss stood near the back, leaning against a bulkhead with her arms crossed, and she looked exhausted. The cut on her forehead had been sealed with medical adhesive. Her uniform was torn and stained with fluids from half a dozen different species she had helped carry to safety. And her eyes were red-rimmed and heavy. She had not slept. None of the humans had. They were still out in the damaged sections of the station, still searching for survivors, still repairing systems, still carrying the wounded to medical bays that were overflowing with patients of every species. Commander Sorath was the first to move, and every eye in the room tracked him as he crossed the cargo bay with a gait that was wrong. He was limping badly, his left leg dragging, and the scales on his chest were cracked where a falling bulkhead had struck him. And he would have died under that bulkhead if a human marine had not cut through 2 meters of twisted metal to pull him free. The marine had broken 3 ribs doing it. She had kept cutting anyway. Sorath stopped in front of Voss and looked down at her, and for a long time neither of them spoke, and the cargo bay was so silent that the only sound was the distant rhythmic clanging of human engineers still working on repairs somewhere deep in the station. "Why?" Sorath said. It was one word, but it carried the weight of everything. The battle at Kasara, the testimony in the chamber, the speech about wolves, the station tearing itself apart, the human marine who had broken her own bones to save his life. Why? Voss looked up at him, and her expression was so simple and so honest that it was almost painful to witness. "Because you are in danger," she said. "That is enough." Sorath's jaw worked, and his scales shifted through shades of color that Kethvarin had never seen on a Draelith before. Confusion, frustration, something that might have been anger, but might also have been something else entirely. "I was voting to destroy your homeworld," he said, and his voice was rough and low. "An hour before the reactor failed, I stood in that chamber and called for the annihilation of your species. And your people knew this, and they came for me anyway." "Yes," Voss said. "That makes no sense," Sorath said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice, something raw. "In Draelith culture, you protect your own. You fight for your clan. You die for your blood. You do not risk everything for an enemy who wants to erase you from existence. There is no strategic value in what your people did, no tactical advantage, no gain." Voss pushed herself off the bulkhead and stood straight, and even though she barely reached Sorath's chest, she held his gaze without wavering. "You are right," she said. "There was no strategic value, and we did not do it for strategic value, and I know that is hard for you to understand, because your entire civilization is built on the idea that strength means dominance and power means control." She took a breath. "But that is not what strength means to us." She looked past Sorath to the rest of the assembly, the bruised and battered delegates, the species that had tried to condemn her kind just hours ago, the alien faces that now looked at her with expressions she could not fully read, but that were very different from the fear and hostility she had faced before. "Even the fiercest can choose compassion over violence," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it filled the room the way light fills a dark space, not by force, but by simply being what it is. That is what makes us dangerous. Not that we are strong, not that we can kill, not that we can endure, but that we can do all of those things and still choose to help, still choose to heal, still choose to save the people who are trying to destroy us. Her eyes glistened, but her voice did not break. The real power is never in the ability to destroy, it is in the ability to choose not to. And that choice is what makes us human, and it is the only thing about us that actually matters. The silence that followed was not the stunned silence of the chamber during the testimony, or the heavy silence after the battle footage. It was something different, something Kethvarin felt in the deepest part of himself, in the place where 300 years of predatory instinct lived. It was the silence of something changing. Kethvarin rose. He had not planned to speak. He was a senior diplomat, cautious by nature, trained to observe and calculate before acting. But something moved in him that was older than training and deeper than caution. And he found himself standing before the assembly, with his forearms at his sides, and his compound eyes reflecting the emergency lights. "I have been a predator my entire life," he said, and his voice was steady even though something inside him was trembling. "The Veloxi have been hunters for 50 million years. It is in our blood, in our chitin, in every cell of our bodies, and in all that time, across all those millennia, we have understood strength to mean one thing, the ability to kill." He looked at Voss. "I have never once considered that strength could mean restraint." He turned to face the assembly fully. "The humans have shown me something today that I do not yet fully understand, but I wish to understand it, and I cannot do that if they are dead, and so the Veloxi Dominion withdraws its support for the strike against Earth, and formally requests that the vote be postponed indefinitely." The effect was immediate. The Veloxi were one of the oldest and most powerful species in the Concord, and their withdrawal changed the political mathematics of the room entirely. Scholar Dren was next. Form pulsed with deep blue light, as the collective's voice resonated through the cargo bay. "The Urani collective concurs. The humans saved our people on Velsha when no one else would, and today they saved our delegates when they had every reason not to. We will not repay that by voting for their destruction." The Kylothi spread their feathers in the gesture of agreement. The Pelennor flashed bioluminescent patterns of ascent through the walls of their mobile tanks. One by one, species withdrew their support for the strike, some out of genuine change of heart, some out of political calculation, some simply because they had seen a human pull someone from a burning corridor and could not reconcile that image with the idea of a species that needed to be exterminated. Even Umivani opened her eyes and spoke, and the Selthari cloud above her was calm for the first time all day. "The aberration we found in the human mind," she said softly, "the enemy. We have spent years trying to classify it as a defect, a mutation, an error in cognitive architecture. But today we watched it in action, and we believe now that it is not an aberration at all." She looked at Voss with something that might have been reverence. "It may be an evolution that we have not yet achieved." Sorath was the last. He stood apart from the others, his wounded leg rigid, his scales still dark, his face unreadable, and the entire room watched him because everyone knew that without the Drelith, the strike was dead. But with them, it might still have enough support to proceed. He looked at Voss for a very long time. "I do not trust you," he said finally. "I know," Voss replied. "I do not understand you. I know that too. I watched your soldier break her own ribs to save my life, and I still do not understand why, and it makes me angry that I do not understand, and it makes me angrier that part of me wants to." Voss nodded. "I will not withdraw my opposition," Sorath said, and the room tensed. "But I will not call for the vote. Not today, because I have questions that I cannot answer, and it would be dishonorable to kill something I do not understand." He fixed Voss with a hard stare. "I will be watching you, human." Voss met his gaze without flinching, and something passed between them that was not friendship and was not peace, but was something that had the potential to become both, if given enough time. "Good," she said. "That is how trust starts." Sorath held her gaze for one more moment, and then he turned and limped out of the cargo bay, and his soldiers followed in silence, and the room exhaled. Zelen declared the session closed without ceremony, and the delegates began to disperse, moving slowly through the damaged corridors of a station that was held together by emergency welds and human stubbornness. Kethvarin did not leave. Immediately, he made his way to an observation deck on the upper ring, one of the few that still had intact windows, and he stood there looking out at the void as the human escort fleet moved into position around Axis Primara, their ships attaching tow cables and stabilization fields to the crippled station, preparing to guide it to the nearest safe harbor. They worked in silence, and with the kind of quiet competence that suggested this was not unusual for them, saving things that were broken, fixing things that were failing, holding things together when everything was falling apart. Kethvarin watched them and thought about predators. He had been one his entire life, and his species had been predators for longer than most civilizations had existed, and the fundamental truth of being a predator was simple. Strength was measured by what you could kill. But standing here, watching these small, fierce, impossible creatures haul a dying station to safety, nothing to gain and everything to lose, he felt that fundamental truth crack like old chitin, and beneath it was something new and frightening and beautiful. The galaxy had spent millennia believing that the most dangerous species would be the one that could kill anything. Perhaps the most dangerous species was the one that could kill anything and chose not to. Kethvarin stood at the window for a long time, watching the human ships work, and he turned that thought over in his ancient mind, and he decided that dangerous was not the right word for what he was seeing. He did not yet know what the right word was, but standing there in the dim light of a broken station, watching the fiercest species in the galaxy choose compassion over violence for no reason other than that it was the right thing to do, he thought that the word might be hopeful. And for the first time in 312 years, the old predator felt something he had never felt before. Not fear, not hunger, not the thrill of the hunt, but a small quiet warmth in his chest that had no name in the Veloxi language. He suspected the humans had a word for it. They seemed to have words for everything that mattered.